There are certain scents that never truly leave us, no matter how many years have passed. For some men, it is tobacco. For others, the perfume of a lover, or the faint tang of gun oil. For me, it has always been ink, the heavy, almost metallic odor of it, caught in the throat when one lingers too long in a college library. Paper itself carries little aroma. It is the ink that stains, that lingers, that clings to memory, as though the words upon the page had been breathed rather than written. That night, or rather that rain-darkened afternoon sliding imperceptibly into night, I found myself once more within the cloisters of a college whose name I will withhold. The corridors stretched like a chess problem, long, intricate, seemingly straightforward until one considered the implications of each move. I had been summoned not by urgency, but by something vaguer, something that suggested unease without yet conceding to alarm. A tutor, retiring in manner but not in intellect, had telephoned the station. A trivial matter, perhaps. A student went missing for the evening. Yet the tutor's voice betrayed a certain tension, the kind that comes when instinct tells us what the mind cannot yet phrase. Lewis walked beside me, his steps echoing with the slight awkwardness that marked his every attempt to be inconspicuous. He asked whether we expected to find anything serious. I muttered that seriousness was a word best applied retrospectively. Too many tragedies had entered Oxford life beneath the heading of trifles. The porter's lodge smelled of polish and damp coats. A kettle whistled somewhere unseen. The register of keys hung on its rack with two gaps, ordinary enough, except that one of them was for a room whose occupant had been absent since morning. I traced the gap with my eyes longer than I intended, and the porter shifted uncomfortably, as though my gaze were an accusation. We were shown into the tutor's room, where the fire gave more smoke than heat. His desk was a battlefield of essays, each stabbed with red corrections. I found my eyes drawn to the margins of small symbols, almost hieroglyphic, which I recognized at once. A crossword man, then. One clue caught my eye in the margin of a half-corrected paper. Unattended note in a deserted room, 7, I murmured it aloud, half to myself. The tutor blinked, as though surprised at my curiosity. Yet there is no such thing as idle ink. The words a man leaves behind are never innocent. The answer would come later, as answers always do. The tutor explained haltingly, nervously, that the student in question was reliable, studious, not given to wanderings or indiscretions. A room untouched, books left open upon the desk, a fountain pen uncapped beside an unfinished sentence. I asked whether he had looked at the pen. He had not. Lewis frowned, unable to see the point, but I insisted we go. The student's staircase was silent, except for the drip of water somewhere near the roof. We climbed slowly, and I thought again of the smell of ink, how it pervades such places, how it can betray both diligence and despair. The door stood ajar, which struck me less as carelessness than as a decision. Inside, the air was close, faintly sour, with the perfume of damp wool. Books indeed lay scattered across the desk, and there was the pen, lying across the page, as though it had been placed rather than dropped. The ink had seeped outward in a small black bloom, obscuring whatever word had been forming. I bent closer. It was not smudged by haste, nor blurred by accident. It was deliberate. Someone had allowed the ink to spread, to blot, to mask. Lewis asked what I saw. I told him nothing yet, though in truth I had seen enough to unsettle me. A blot of ink is a commonplace, but it is also a mask, and masks are seldom unmeant. The window overlooked the quad where rain slid silver across the flagstones. Students hurried by, collars up, heads bowed, their lives moving briskly on. Within the room, time had paused at the moment of that blot, as though everything that mattered had been compressed into it. I touched the pen still faintly wet and noted the ink upon my fingers. A trivial detail, yes, but it was there that the case began to take its first whisper of shape, just as a crossword clue begins not with certainty, but with a faint suspicion that the word, once found, will explain far more than it ought. I left the room with the taste of ink on my tongue and the sense that Oxford had once again concealed something darker than scholarship within its walls. Death in Oxford is never quite like death elsewhere. It enters quietly, muffled by stone, absorbed by centuries of precedent. There is no wailing, no public grief, only the measured hush of a community trained to mask its disquiet behind the rituals of tea, chapel, and academic duty. That evening the announcement travelled swiftly but with an odd restraint. A student, bright, promising, diligent, had been found collapsed in his own room, and though no one spoke of it, the word suicide sat heavily in the silence, waiting for someone to lift or confirm it. I stood in the quad when Lewis came to tell me. His voice was lowered, as though even the pigeons might overhear and spread gossip. "They've brought the doctor," he said, "but it's too late." I asked nothing further. One learns over years to distinguish what is beyond recovery. I lit a cigarette, though I rarely smoke these days, and let the smoke curl upward to meet the rain. Inside, the staircase smelt of wet stone and the faint sweetness of extinguished candles. The porter had locked the door, but the master himself produced the key, as though propriety were still being maintained, even when a body had ceased to care for such things. We entered together, though only Lewis betrayed the discomfort of a man unused to rooms where life had so recently departed. The scholar lay half-turned on the bed, as though sleep had betrayed him midway. His hand, still, clutched the sheet, knuckles pale, as if he had resisted not death but the cold that follows it. On the desk, the blot of ink I had seen earlier seemed now like a signature, completed not with letters, but with silence. A glass on the floor, empty. Beside it, a small bottle whose label announced itself in the clipped tones of the college physician. Nothing overtly sinister, nothing yet overtly accidental. Death in Oxford seldom declares itself loudly. I listened as the doctor muttered words, clinical, detached, certain. But certainty often disguises itself in jargon. Lewis leaned close to me and whispered, "Do you think he did it to himself?" I said only that a pen left uncapped on a desk had always struck me as a poor farewell. He frowned, as though I had chosen the most irrelevant of details. Yet I had long learnt to follow the irrelevant. It was often the one thread that unravelled the rest. The tutor who had summoned us earlier appeared at the doorway, face pale, but eyes still calculating, as though wondering whether grief would interrupt or enhance his lecture the next morning. He spoke of the student's brilliance, his essays, and his attendance at chapel. He spoke of routine, of discipline, of everything but the possibility of despair. I asked him whether the boy had friends. He hesitated, then murmured something about acquaintances, the way one speaks when acknowledging the absence of intimacy. There was no one then to notice if his silences had lengthened. I bent again toward the desk. The crossword clue stared up at me, still an unattended note in a deserted room. 7, my mind ticked through possibilities, message perhaps, or silence itself. But one word lodged quietly at the back of my thoughts, abandon. 7 letters, exact fit. The ink blot covered what might have been the first or last of those letters. I told no one my thoughts. Some deductions belong only to the solitude of the moment. We left the room under the rain's steady percussion. The porter locked the door once more, as though such a gesture could protect the dead from intrusion. Outside, Lewis asked if I believed it. If I believed the young man had chosen his own end. I answered only that Oxford had a way of choosing for people, whether they realized it or not. He looked at me as though I had spoken nonsense, but said nothing more. Back at the lodge, the kettle still whistled. Students passed with their essays clutched under arms, glancing briefly at the police in their quad before hurrying on. I thought of the smell of ink, how it persists, how it lingers in the nose long after the book is shut. Death in Oxford is much the same. It marks us, whether we read it rightly or not. And in that silent marking, the first questions of the case had begun, though no answers yet revealed themselves. If death arrives in Oxford like a whisper, suspicion follows like a shadow. It creeps along the cloisters, lingers in lecture halls, and hides in the margins of conversation. That morning, when the news had hardened into fact, the college closed ranks with its usual efficiency. No one admitted to shock, no one wept in public. They spoke of the young man as though he had already been footnoted into history, a scholar promising but unfinished, the kind of life that tutors catalogue with equal parts regret and detachment. Lewis and I sat in the senior common room, a place where mahogany and pipe smoke had seen more secrets than any police station. The dons entered in pairs, their voices low, their eyes assessing. A death among their number, however young, was an inconvenience, yes, but also an exposure. Universities thrive on reputation. Death corrodes reputation as surely as mildew on vellum. The master asked whether we had questions. I said we had too many, and he offered a tight smile, the kind designed to close rather than open doors. Still, one or two figures drew my attention. A fellow in philosophy, sharp-featured, whose gaze slipped from mine too quickly. A historian, heavy-set, whose irritation seemed less with the death than with the interruption to his research leave. Small things, perhaps, but it is in the small things that the fabric begins to fray. I asked the bursar whether the boy had debts. He replied that the college accounts were in order. The boy's family, I later learned, was neither rich nor poor, but careful. Too careful, perhaps, to allow the son to wander without restraint. A pressure of another kind, then. Lewis whispered that students kill themselves over love more often than over money. I said nothing. In Oxford, love is often another word for loneliness. Later, in the library, I walked the narrow aisles where the smell of leather and dust seemed more permanent than any human life. A fellow student stood by the catalogue, nervously flipping cards as though looking for the right entry. When I asked if he had known the deceased, he nodded too quickly, then shrugged. He spoke of brilliance, of kindness, of a silence that had grown louder these past weeks. But his eyes shifted when I mentioned the blot of ink, the crossword clue, as though he too had stared at that mark and wondered. He excused himself soon after. His departure struck me as hasty, though Lewis dismissed it as youthful awkwardness. I have long distrusted youthful awkwardness. It so often hides something deliberate. That evening, I examined the student's essays, spread like abandoned sermons across his desk. The margins held more than the tutor's corrections. Scribbled in another hand, perhaps the boy's own, were phrases half cryptic, half desperate. One line caught me. The answer is never in the clue, only in the gaps between. A curious thought for a boy of 20, cry perhaps for someone to read him differently. Lewis asked if I suspected foul play. I told him suspicion was the natural state of Oxford. He pressed further. Who then, the tutor? The fellow student, the philosopher who avoided my eyes? I said only that the margins interested me more than the text. In every essay, in every life, the truth is scribbled not where one expects it, but in the cramped, overlooked spaces. He sighed, accustomed now to my evasions. Walking back through the quad, rain dripping from the gargoyles, I considered the crossword clue again. Unattended note in a deserted room. 7. Abandon had seemed plausible, but another word was teased at me. Message. 7 letters, a fit as good as the first. What if the blot was not concealment but communication? What if the boy, rather than ending his life, had left something for another to find? A note, a signal, a message erased by ink, but not yet forgotten. I kept the thought to myself. One does not voice such uncertainties in Oxford too soon. Better to hold them quietly, to let them settle like sediment in a glass. Only then does the shape of the truth begin to reveal itself. And so I left the library that night with the scent of ink still clinging to my hands, and the uneasy certainty that the dead are never quite silent here. They write their secrets in margins, waiting for someone foolish enough or lonely enough to read them. The crossword has always been more than a pastime to me. It is a pattern, a window through which the muddle of life sometimes arranges itself into order. Words demand precision, yet they hide behind deceit. Clues masquerade as nonsense until one finds the slant, the pressure point where meaning gives way. So it was with the boy's room, the blot of ink, the unfinished page. A crossword clue without an answer is less an omission than an accusation. It gnaws. I took the papers back with me that evening, though Lewis muttered something about evidence and procedure. Procedure rarely solves anything words do. In my flat, with the smell of whiskey sharp in the air, I laid the essays out across the table. Red scrawls of the tutor fought against the neat black of the student's own hand, and there, in the margin, the half-finished clue unattended note in a deserted room, 7. I let the whiskey sit on my tongue until it burnt, and then, with pencil in hand, began. Abandonment had been my first thought, a neat fit, 7 letters, the sense of neglect, of absence, but it felt too obvious, too much the word any competent solver would grasp. Crossword setters, true ones, the clever ones always preferred the twist. Another possibility, then message, a note, unattended, left behind, 7 again. My pencil hovered over the margin, yet something resisted. The boy had been careful, meticulous, not one for the easy solution. The blot of ink suggested hesitation, not accident. Perhaps he had found an answer. He did not dare commit to the page. I thought of other words, ran them silently across the grooves of my mind. Epistle. No, too long. Missive, 6 letters only. Silence eyes, that worked. And there was a coldness in it that fitted the room as I remembered it. But could silence itself be called a note? Perhaps it could. In Oxford, where silence is often louder than speech. It was well after midnight when Lewis telephoned. He had been through the boy's timetable, found nothing unusual. He asked if I had. I told him only that the crossword was more interesting than the lectures. He sighed, weary of what he thought of my indulgence, but I could hear it, even over the crackle of the line, the unspoken respect, the reluctant trust. He had seen before how a single word, correctly placed, could unravel more than weeks of interviews. The following morning I returned to the library. The Don in philosophy was there, pretending to read but watching the catalogue more than the page. I asked whether he had known the boy. He said the young man was diligent but distant. He asked why I inquired. I told him only that one can learn more from the margins than from the essays themselves. He smiled thinly, a smile that gave nothing away. Yet when he left, he closed the book too sharply, as if the act of shutting knowledge might prevent its leaking. A gesture, small, but it lodged in my memory. Back at the lodge, I looked again at the porter's register. 2 keys are still missing. One belonged to the dead boy, the other belonged to the historian, who had seemed so irritated by our presence. I asked the porter if this was usual. He hesitated, then said the historian often left his key, claiming forgetfulness. But forgetfulness is seldom consistent. It is either careless or it is calculated. And I thought of the crossword again, silence, message, abandon all possible, all true, all unsatisfactory. Which answer, then, would the boy have left for us? That night I wrote the 3 words side by side in my notebook, and let them stare back at me like suspects lined in a row. Abandon, message, silence. Each fitted, each failed. Each was a life in miniature. I poured another glass, leaned back, and let the whiskey dull the edges of thought. Some answers are not found in the clue at all, but in the spaces it leaves. I closed my eyes and knew only that the boy had written something and someone else had read it before me. Red herrings come in many disguises. In police reports, they are the tidy notes that lead nowhere. In conversation, the offhand remark distracts more than it reveals. But on the printed page, they take their most insidious form, laid with intention, words meant to mislead. It was in the boy's books, piled on his desk and in his satchel, that I began to see how easily one could be persuaded to follow the wrong trail. Lewis had fetched the volumes at my request, a sheaf of philosophy texts, histories of music, even a thin book of verse with a spine so cracked it looked like it had been read in desperation rather than delight. Among them, one stood apart. A periodical, unremarkable in appearance, tucked inside an essay as though it had been hidden yet not hidden enough. A journal devoted to student writing articles on politics, campus gossip, and earnest essays on literature. It was dog-eared at one particular page. I read it, then read it again, while Lewis shifted impatiently in his chair. An article, unsigned, or rather, signed, with initials that could have belonged to anyone. A meditation on solitude, framed with quotations half-digested from Kierkegaard and Auden. It spoke of the futility of learning without love, of the emptiness of libraries after midnight, of the temptation to turn ink into confession, too neat, too exact. Lewis remarked that it sounded like the boy himself, and yet I knew it was not. The style was borrowed, imitative, almost rehearsed, a performance of despair rather than the thing itself, a red herring in print. Later that afternoon, I questioned the tutor again. He insisted the boy had been steady, diligent, the sort who might suffer from melancholy but never from melodrama. He dismissed the journal piece as coincidental. But his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, or recognition too hastily concealed, a gesture so slight that Lewis missed it. I did not. The master of the college tried to steer us away from the periodical altogether. He said such writings were common, the melodramas of youth, not to be taken as omens. He poured tea, spoke of the boy's promising future, the tragedy of its curtailment. Yet all the while he touched the rim of his cup with the same finger, circling it nervously as if tracing some private word only he could read. Anxiety rarely needs translation. That evening in my room I laid the article beside the crossword clue. Abandon, message, silence. Each word pressed harder upon me in light of the essay's counterfeit melancholy. If the boy had truly despaired, he would not have borrowed phrases so clumsily. Despair, when it comes, is original. No one plagiarizes grief. And so I began to see the piece for what it was, not a cry for help, but a mask, planted perhaps to confirm a narrative already being woven around his death. Lewis suggested we investigate the initials at the bottom of the article. I told him initials prove little. They are often chosen precisely to obscure. But I agreed we should trace them. It was a matter of procedure after all. Yet even as he wrote them down, I was certain they would lead us in circles. A red herring, cleverly placed, draws the dog away from the scent. And I had begun to believe that someone within those walls was no stranger to such tactics. The library was quiet when I returned later that night. A single lamp glowed on the far desk, where a student copied notes as though time itself depended upon it. The rain had slackened, leaving the air thick with the smell of stone. I wandered the aisles until I found the shelf, where bound volumes of the periodical rested. I pulled several at random. Some pages bore familiar handwriting in the margins, comments, symbols, little doodles. Not the boys, but the tutors. His small crossword notations appeared even here, as though he could not refrain from annotating every printed word he touched. And on the page before me, in faint pencil, a word circled in his hand, silence. I traced it with my finger, as if by touching it I might feel the intention beneath. Silence circled in the tutor's hand. Coincidence, perhaps, or a clue hiding in plain sight. I closed the book, returned it to the shelf, and let the thought linger. A red herring may divert, yes, but sometimes it leaves its own shadow. And in that shadow the truth waits, impatient, watchful, unspoken. Her name surfaced first as a murmur, scarcely more than a whisper in the porter's log. Claire. A student, though not in the same faculty as the dead boy. Her connection to him was spoken of reluctantly, as though even acknowledging it lent weight to rumour. Lewis told me she had been seen with him in the quad once or twice, nothing unusual. But in Oxford, nothing is ever truly casual. The simplest meeting takes on the architecture of secrecy. I found her in the chapel, seated 2 rows from the front, though the place was otherwise empty. The air smelt of stone dampened by candle smoke, and the faint residue of organ practice still hung about. She did not turn as I approached. When I asked if she had known him, she nodded once, as though answering in class. But no words followed. Silence, stretched so thin it seemed to tremble. I sat beside her, uninvited. She glanced at me then, a brief flash of defiance or fear, or both. "He was kind," she said finally, the sort of kindness that unsettled more than it comforted. I asked what she meant, but she shook her head, the gesture final. Some truths, I realized, were better measured in what was withheld than what was spoken. Lewis later suggested she was frightened. I told him silence is not always fear. Sometimes it is loyalty or guilt. He muttered that I saw patterns where there were none, and yet he, too, had noticed the way she avoided our eyes when she left the chapel, her steps quick, her hands tight at her sides. Small gestures speak louder than declarations. That evening I thought again of the crossword clue. Silence. 7 letters. A word that now seemed less an answer than a motif. The boy's blot of ink, the tutor's circled word in the periodical, and now this girl's refusal to speak. Silence, not as absence, but as message. I wrote it again in my notebook, underlining it this time. Silence can be louder than any scream, and infinitely more dangerous. The next day, I walked past the Bodleian in the rain, thinking of her. Claire. A name that clung to the memory like a refrain. I remembered the way she had folded her hands, fingertips pressed hard together as though she were keeping something inside. Had she loved him? Had she pitied him? Or had she simply seen something she dared not voice? Oxford is full of observers, students, dons, porters, all watching, none willing to speak until forced. Lewis pressed me again. What do you think she knows? I told him only that she knew enough to keep still. He frowned, impatient, but said nothing more. He has always trusted my silences, though he will not admit it. That night I returned to the chapel alone. The place was empty, save for the faint echo of dripping water from the gutters outside. I sat where she had sat, staring at the stone, at the altar, lit faintly by the moon. It was then I noticed the hymnal on the pew in front of me, open though no service had been held, a page marked not with a ribbon, but with the faint impression of pencil, a word almost erased, wait. My fingers traced the indentation. It was not hers. I could not be sure. Yet the word settled in my mind with the weight of something intentional, Wait, a clue, perhaps, or a plea. I left the chapel with rain in my coat and whiskey already on my tongue, though I had yet to drink it. Claire's silence, the tutor's margin, the boy's ballot, all spoke the same language. Not despair, not confession, something else, something threaded through ink and absence, through gestures and omissions. I did not yet know its shape. But I knew that the truth was not to be found in what had been said. It lived in the quiet, waiting, in the spaces between. And Claire, whether by love, loyalty, or fear, was its custodian. The library, more than any police station, has always seemed to me the proper arena for guilt. Not because books lie, they seldom doubt, because the silence they demand allows deceit to flourish unchecked. It was in the library, under that perpetual smell of dust and ink, that I sought out the figure who had threaded quietly through the case without once drawing notice to the librarian. A woman whose face was as pale as the pages she catalogued, whose voice carried the dry rustle of paper. She greeted me without surprise. In Oxford, policemen are as inevitable as winter rains. She said she had heard of the boy's death. Her eyes did not flicker. She asked if I wanted records, borrowing slips, dates. I nodded, and she slid the ledger toward me with the precision of a ritual. The ink entries were neat, almost obsessive. The boy had borrowed widely music, philosophy, even theology, but always returned them punctually. Only one book remained unreturned, a slim volume on codes and ciphers. She added that it was not unusual. Students, she said, were careless, but her voice caught slightly at the word, as though it were one she did not wholly believe. Lewis asked where she had been the night of the boy's death. She did not flinch. At home, she said, with her sister. He pressed further, and she described the evening supper at 7, radio at 8, bed at 10:30. The account was too exact, the kind that suggested rehearsal. Alibis, I've always thought, are most suspect when offered too readily. Innocence tends to forget the hour. I asked her if she knew him well. She paused, longer than comfort allowed, before saying he was quiet but curious. He had asked for unusual requests, volumes few, undergraduate sort. Once, she said, he had lingered after closing, staring at a crossword in the back of a newspaper she had left on the desk. He had remarked almost to himself that clues were like confessions. They seemed meaningless until one looked sideways. She recalled this not with amusement, but with unease, as though the remark had unsettled her. Lewis dismissed it as a trivial memory, but I did not. A crossword, again, silence, abandon, message. The words circled me still. That the boy had thought of confessions in the language of puzzles seemed no accident. Nor did it escape me that the librarian remembered it so vividly. Later, as I left, I glanced back at her desk. A pile of journals, bound in rough paper, lay neatly stacked. On the topmost, I saw faint pencil notations in the margin, tiny symbols almost like shorthand. One of them caught me a small cross beside the word silence in a poem. I asked her about it. She said it was nothing, merely a cataloguer's mark. But her cheeks coloured slightly, a blush she could not suppress. Lewis did not notice. I did. That evening, back in my flat, I replayed her words, at home with her sister. Radio at 8, bed at 10:30. I could not say why, but the detail of the radio troubled me. I recalled that on the night of the boy's death, the storm had knocked out reception across half the city. Had she forgotten? Or had she never turned the dial at all? It was a small thing, easily explained, and yet in such small things lies the fracture line of truth. I poured myself a whiskey and stared at the crossword again. A new clue awaited me in the evening paper untrue record held by Scholar 5. I let it sit. The answer came after a moment. Alibi. Neat, cruel, exact. The librarian's words returned, each detail, each over-precise time. Untrue record held by scholars. A definition as damning as any confession. I closed the paper and let the glass rest on my knee. The librarian's alibi might hold, or it might not. Perhaps her sister would confirm it. Perhaps she would not. But already I felt the case shift like a chord struck in a minor key. The boy's silence, Claire's refusal, the tutor's margins, all of them were notes in a score I could not yet play. And somewhere beneath it, the librarian's voice, steady but strained, waiting for the moment when silence would fail her. It was in the quiet hours when Oxford seemed most itself, rain soft against stone, cloisters emptied of voices, that I returned to the poem. The journal where it had first appeared had never quite left my desk, though I had turned it face down more than once, unwilling to see those two neat sentences staring at me. Yet something in them pressed still. A counterfeit grief, yes, but one that had borrowed too well from truth to be dismissed entirely. Lewis thought it futile. He asked why I read the thing again, why I let words that might have been nothing more than student theatrics eat into the night. Because words matter, I told him, though he shook his head. He has always believed in the tangibility of things, keys, bottles, fingerprints. But Oxford lives in its words, and men die by them too. The poem itself was meandering, a catalogue of solitude, the echo of footsteps in a deserted quad, the futility of study, the yearning for connection that never arrived. Melancholy dressed up for publication. What caught me now was not its sentiment, but its structure. One stanza shorter than the rest, a sudden fracture in rhythm, 5 lines where there should have been 6. I knew enough of prosody to suspect that absence was deliberate, a silence embedded in the form rather than in the content. I copied the lines into my notebook, each phrase separated, and left a blank space where the missing one should have stood. It gaped at me, wordless, and yet it said more than any of the verses around it. That afternoon I returned to the library, the journal hidden under my arm like contraband. The librarian, pale as ever, nodded as I passed, but asked no questions. In the reading room, I compared the printed version with another copy from the bound volumes. There was a subtle difference but unmistakable, a single word altered in the final stanza. Where my copy read shadow, the bound copy read silence. A misprint perhaps, or perhaps not. Silence again. The word followed me like a ghost. Lewis later asked if I was chasing phantoms. I told him phantoms sometimes leave footprints. He sighed, and we walked on in uneasy companionship through the quad, where the damp stones glistened like old memories. Students passed us, whispering, carrying their books as though they might shield them from the weather. I envied them briefly, their ignorance of how easily ink could be twisted into evidence. That evening, alone again, I set the poem beside the crossword. Silence, abandon, message. The same words seemed to repeat themselves, as though the case had its own limited vocabulary. I wondered if the boy had written the poem himself, unsigned, hidden in plain sight, or had someone written it for him to lend credence to a narrative of despair. The margins of the periodical bore no handwriting, yet I could not shake the memory of the tutor's crossword marks, scattered like breadcrumbs through every text he touched. He would have noticed the missing line, the altered word. Perhaps he had even placed it there. I poured a whiskey and let the glass rest against my forehead. In the poem's missing stanza, I imagined the boy's voice, calm, precise, withholding something essential. The absence itself became the message. Silence, not as emptiness, but as intent. It was then I recalled Claire, her lips pressed shut in the chapel, her hands folded too tightly. She, too, had spoken through absence. What she withheld and what the poem withheld were of the same order, a communication by omission. The fire had burnt low when another detail surfaced in my memory. At the inquest, the tutor had quoted a line from Auden with an ease too smooth to be spontaneous. The same line, I now realized, had been woven into the poem. Not widely known, not often cited, the echo was unmistakable. A borrowed grief recited by one who wished to frame it. I wrote the line in my notebook, underlined it twice, and closed the journal with more force than intended. The rain had stopped by then, but the silence outside was thicker than the sound of it had been. Oxford at night absorbed secrets into its stone. And in that quiet I thought of the poem again, not for what it said, but for what it refused to say. A silence more eloquent than words, more dangerous too. I sat back, glass empty, and let it remain unanswered, like a clue in a crossword I was not yet ready to fill. Affairs, like poems, leave more in the margins than in the text itself. Oxford thrives on them, though they are rarely spoken of directly. They exist in glances across libraries, in letters slipped beneath doors, in sudden changes of timetable. It was no surprise, then, when Claire's silence began to take on the shape of such an affair, not with the boy, as Lewis assumed, but with someone older, someone more dangerous to admit. The first hint came not from her, but from the historian, a man of bulk and gruffness who dismissed my questions with irritation, as though I were interrupting an appointment with his books. He let slip one sentence, though, as careless men often do. He said the boy was too young to understand Claire, too young for the sort of entanglements she encouraged. Then he stopped, as if he had revealed more than he meant. I watched the flush creep into his neck, and he turned away abruptly. Lewis missed it, and I did not. In Oxford, a single overheard remark can unravel years of pretense. Later I asked Claire again, gently, whether she had loved the boy. She shook her head too firmly, her voice caught between denial and defense. No, she said, not him. And there it was, the fracture. She had denied the wrong accusation, too quickly, too completely. Love is seldom denied so readily unless it hides elsewhere. I asked nothing further. The silence between us was more eloquent than any confession. That evening, I walked past the Radcliffe camera in the rain, the cobbles slick, the lamps diffusing halos through mist. My thoughts circled the possibility, a past affair hidden beneath the college's respectability. It would explain the evasions, the misplaced grief, the poem that read like a mask. Affairs always leave debris letters, gestures, the faint smell of another's tobacco clinging to a coat. I needed only to look in the right place. The place, it turned out, was the librarian's desk. I had returned under the pretense of checking borrowings, but it was a letter left half-hidden among catalogues that drew my eye. The handwriting was unmistakably Claire's, sharp, hurried, with the slight lean of a writer unused to concealment. The letter spoke not of the boy, but of an older man. It did not name him, but spoke of lectures missed, meetings delayed, of guilt and secrecy. I slid the paper back without comment, but the weight of it stayed with me. Lewis grew impatient when I told him. He muttered that students and dons had been tangled for centuries, and that such matters rarely ended in murder. Perhaps not, I replied, but they often ended in silence. He shook his head, weary of my abstractions, but said nothing more. I poured us both whiskey, though he left it untouched. That night I studied the crossword again. The clue read, "Old flame rekindled, hiding nothing six." I let it sit. The answer was affair. Simple, almost cruelly so, And there it was, printed plainly before me as though the setter had known the case as intimately as I. Old flame rekindled, hiding nothing. 6 letters. Exact, unflinching. I wrote it beneath silence, abandon, message, and felt the pattern grow heavier, though not yet complete. The next day I watched Claire in the quad. She walked swiftly, her books clutched tight, but when the historian passed her, she looked away too sharply, as if the air itself had become dangerous to breathe. A small gesture, easily overlooked, but it confirmed what I had suspected. Their past was written not in words but in avoidance, in glances that lingered too long or not long enough. A past affair concealed beneath layers of scholarship and duty, now threatening to surface in the wake of the boy's death. I did not confront her, not yet. Affairs, like poems, unravel best when left to expose themselves. I left her to her silence, the historian to his irritation, and the librarian to her meticulous records. But I walked away knowing that the boy's death was no longer only his own. It was entangled with older sins, with secrets that had long preceded him. Oxford carries its past heavily, like a library whose shelves are too full to bear another volume, and in that weight another life had been crushed, another silence pressed into permanence. Alibis are like poems. Some are clumsy, transparent in their pretense, while others are crafted with such care that even disbelief feels impolite. The librarians had been of the latter kind, too neat, too rehearsed. Supper at 7, radio at 8, bed at 10:30. Each detail was placed as carefully as the catalogue cards she tended, and just as impersonal. But lies, I've found, are like books. However carefully bound, they leave fingerprints on the margins. I began with the radio. That stormy night, reception had faltered across half the city. Even my own set, stubborn as it was, produced nothing but static. Yet she had insisted upon listening at 8. When I asked her again, days later, she repeated the details almost word for word. She spoke of a particular program, one she claimed not to miss. It was the repetition that struck me, the exact phrasing, the absence of hesitation. Innocence seldom recites, it remembers unevenly, hesitantly, with the softness of lived truth. Lewis thought me fanciful. He said people cling to habits, that her memory of the evening might simply be fixed in routine. Perhaps. But routine collapses under pressure, and the tremor in her voice when I pressed her was not routine. It was rehearsal, fraying at the edges. In the Bodleian one afternoon, I asked the assistant whether the librarian often borrowed books herself. He smiled, faintly amused, and told me she was notorious for it. She read widely, compulsively. He mentioned, quite without prompting, that she had signed out a volume on ciphers just a week before the boy's death. I thanked him and left without further questions. The unreturned book in the boy's name, I realized, had once passed through her hands. That evening I sat in my flat with the crossword. The clue read, "Cover story finally broken, revealing lie 5. The answer came at once, alibi. Again. The word returned as if the setter mocked me. Cover story, broken, 5 letters only, but enough to unravel her careful recital. I let the pencil rest, unwilling to commit it to the square, though I knew it fit too well. When I confronted her, not in the formal way, but in the manner of a question asked over a desk, she faltered only once. She asked me if silence would condemn her, if failing to defend herself would be treated as confession. Her eyes were not frightened, only weary. I told her silence rarely saves anyone. She looked past me then, out toward the rain, and said she had been in the library late that night, alone, cataloguing, not at home with her sister at all. She had lied, she admitted, because she feared the scandal of being linked to the boy's final hours. She said he had come to return the cipher book. She said nothing more, Lewis later asked why she had lied if she had done nothing wrong. I told him people fear disgrace more than justice. In Oxford, reputation is its own punishment. He frowned, unconvinced, but I could not shake the image of her pale face, the way her hands lingered on the catalogue cards, as though order itself might absolve her. She had been alone, yes, but was aloneness enough to shield her? The alibi unmasked, I felt no triumph, only the cold air of absence of a story cut short before its conclusion. If she had lied once, could she not have lied again? If she had been with him in those hours, could she not have shaped the silence that followed? I thought of the poem, the missing line, the altered word. I thought of Claire, mute in the chapel. I thought of the tutor circling silence in his margins. And I thought of the boy, his pen uncapped, ink bleeding into blot, a message left unfinished. That night, the whiskey burnt more sharply than usual. I sat by the window and listened to the rain. Oxford kept its secret still, hidden in books, in silences, in alibis unmasked, but never quite destroyed. I closed my eyes and saw again the crossword square waiting to be filled, its blankness more eloquent than any word I might write. Some answers are too simple, too final. Better, perhaps, to leave them unwritten, allowing the silence to speak in their place. Resolution, if it comes at all, seldom arrives with clarity. It does not declare itself in revelations or handcuffs, but in the subtler hush of an answer that feels less like truth than inevitability. In Oxford, where silence has always spoken louder than confession, I found myself at the end of the case holding more absence than certainty. The boy was dead. That much was incontrovertible. The rest was suggestion, shadows, faint echoes in corridors. Lewis asked me one last time whether I believed the librarian guilty. I told him guilt is a word best reserved for courts, not for conscience. She had lied, yes. She had been there, yes. But whether she had done more than catalogue her books and shield her reputation, I could not say. He frowned, dissatisfied, but left it there. He has always needed answers. I have always distrusted them. Claire avoided me in those final days, slipping past in quads, her eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. I did not call her back. What could she have said that silence had not already expressed? Love, fear, loyalty? All three can look identical when compressed into a refusal. She carried her secret with the composure of someone who knows that exposure is worse than grief. I let her go. Not because I believed her innocent, but because her silence was eloquent enough to remain unbroken. The tutor continued his lectures, scribbling in margins, circling his crosswords, as if nothing had altered. Yet I watched him once, standing alone outside the chapel, and saw his hand tremble faintly as he folded it into his coat. A gesture, small but human. It told me more than any testimony might have done. He, too, had been touched by the boy's death, though whether in guilt or sorrow I could not tell. Oxford men are adept at disguising one as the other. The historian, blustering, retreated to his rooms. His irritation had softened into a wary quietness. Rumour whispered that his past with Claire had been discovered, though no one spoke of it directly. Such scandals fade quickly here, absorbed by the stone, leaving only faint marks in the archive. A past affair, like a misprint in a poem, noticed by some, ignored by most. In my flat, I returned to the crossword for the last time. The clue read, ending quietly, yet unfinished. 7. I stared at it, pencil poised. The answer came slowly, closure. 7 letters, precise, inevitable, and yet closure was not what I felt. The boy's blot of ink, the librarian's alibi, Claire's silence, all remained open squares, unfilled, unanswered. I penciled the word into the grid, but the letters looked wrong, awkward, as if the setter had mocked me once again. Lewis joined me for a whisky. He asked if I would file the report as suicide or suspicious circumstances. I told him suicide, though even as I spoke the word, I felt its inadequacy. Suspicion lingers, longer than evidence. He nodded, accepting it, though he knew as well as I did that suspicion would never wholly fade. I often think of the boy's unfinished sentence, the ink spreading outward like a wound. Whether it masked a confession, a message, or nothing at all, I cannot say, but I have come to believe that the blot itself was the message silence rendered visible, a refusal to be neat, to be catalogued, to be explained. Perhaps he had intended it, perhaps not, but in death, as in life, his absence spoke more than his words. And so the case closed, not with the satisfaction of revelation, but with the quiet resignation that Oxford demands. I walked once more across the quad in the rain, the stones gleaming beneath the lamps, the air sharp with the smell of wet leaves. Students hurried past, essays in hand, oblivious to the silence pressed into the walls around them. I paused beneath the archway, lit another cigarette, and thought of how ink, once spilt, never wholly fades. It stains, it lingers, it reminds. A quiet resolution then, not an answer, not even a conclusion, only the recognition that some mysteries do not end, they settle. They become part of the city, absorbed into its stone, whispered in its libraries, carried in the margins of its books. And perhaps that is all we ever find in Oxford. Not truth, but silence made permanent. Ink and silence, two companions that have followed me through too many investigations, through too many nights when the city seemed more like a manuscript than a place. The boy's blot on the page, the librarian's unsteady recital, Claire's refusal to speak all of it had coalesced into those two things, the permanence of ink and the permanence of silence. One stain, the other lingers. I returned once more to his room, though there was no reason left to. The key hung again on the porter's rack, waiting for no one. Inside, the air had grown stale, books unmoved, papers untouched. The pen still lay across the blot, though someone had tidied the desk, as if order might disguise finality. I stared at that blot longer than I should have. Its edges, dried now, seemed less accidental, more deliberate, a word withheld rather than a word ruined. There is a difference. Lewis asked what I expected to find. I told him ink, and he laughed uneasy, but I meant it. Ink is the only evidence that does not lie. Back in my room, I opened the evening crossword. The clue was a short sound of nothing written down 7. I let it rest for a moment. Then the answer slid into place, silence. Once again, as though the setter conspired against me, the word returned. I penciled it into the squares, and in doing so felt both the futility and the inevitability of it. Every thread of the case led here silence, spoken in different forms. Claire's silence, the librarian's silence, the tutor's silence, even mine. The rain that night was insistent, rattling against the windows like an argument without conclusion. I poured a whisky and thought of Claire in the chapel, her hands pressed together, her lips refusing sound. What was she keeping? Love, fear, or only the knowledge that to speak is sometimes to betray? I could not know, nor could I know whether the librarian's late-night cataloguing was as harmless as she claimed. I had unmasked her alibi, yes, but not her soul. That remained hers, hidden beneath pale skin and meticulous handwriting. I thought, too, of the tutor, his neat crossword notes scattered through margins, the word silence circled in his hand. Did he know more than he admitted, or had he simply been fascinated by the word as I was, drawn to it compulsively? Even now I cannot say. Oxford breeds ambiguity as readily as ivy. Lewis, ever more practical, told me I had reached the end. The report would read, "Suicide, with circumstances not wholly clear." He asked me if I was content with that. I said contentment was for simpler men. He muttered that I looked for mysteries where there were none. Yet he too had stared at the blot of ink, uneasy. Even he could not dismiss it entirely. It is strange the hold that a single mark can have. An unfinished word, obscured by ink, has haunted me more than a dozen confessions shouted in court. It is the refusal of completion, the denial of clarity that unsettles. Perhaps that was the boy's final act, not to confess, not to accuse, but to remind us that life resists neatness. His blot was not a failure. It was a message, though none of us could translate it. I walked once more across the quad before leaving the college for the last time. The stones glistened, the lamps haloed in mist, the smell of wet paper seeping from open windows where students still worked. A city writing itself, line after line, while burying what it cannot voice. I thought of all the words spoken, all the silences kept, and wondered which carried more weight. The answer, I suspect, is silence. In the end, I wrote nothing more in my notebook. I closed it on the words I had already inscribed: abandon, message, silence, affair, alibi, closure. A list not of answers but of echoes, a crossword never fully solved. And perhaps that is what Oxford demands, not solutions, but the acceptance that some clues remain inscrutable, inked over, or swallowed into silence. I drained the glass, let the rain carry its rhythm into the night, and felt the case settle, not resolved, but absorbed. Ink and silence, staining together, inseparable, eternal.